It's been 1 year since the release of Monster Hunter Wilds. I was actually really excited for this game. I'm a relatively new player. Wilds is only my 4th game. I started with World, then I played Iceborne, and then after that I played Rise and Sunbreak, and then in between Wilds and Rise, I played Generations Ultimate on the Switch. Before the beta dropped for Wilds, I was actually pretty apprehensive about the game. They're pivoting to open world, which is already kind of hit or miss for me. And honestly, I've been pretty disappointed by a lot of games recently, so I knew not to hope for this game to be amazing. And in an act of absolute cruelty, the beta gave me so much hope for the game. And then like an idiot, after 2 days of playing the beta, I pre-ordered the game because I was so excited for everything they showed. Needless to say, I was let down pretty hard. I was let down harder than my pants after I've had too much cheese. And before we get into it, let me address something real quick. I've obviously done all the work and research for this video before the 1-year anniversary. If you want to get really specific, I'm probably doing all this around 3 weeks before the anniversary. See, the thing is, I'm 100% confident that nothing that they'll do will change what this video is about. They'd have to change so many things on a fundamental level in order to change anything I have to say, and they're not doing that. So we're here to answer a simple question. Is Monster Hunter Wilds worth playing 1 year after its release? Let's start with something that most people can agree on. The performance on release was awful. This isn't really something that is arguable. Even people who like the game on release acknowledge that the performance sucked. Eventually Capcom themselves acknowledged that the performance was bad, and they've tried multiple times in order to address this issue. At this point, if you can't acknowledge that the performance on release was an issue, I have no idea how you can understand me because we live in different realities. For all of you who live in this reality, performance is one of those things that you don't really notice if it's normal or if it's even really good. However, if it's bad, you're going to notice pretty fast, and it'll probably ruin your entire experience. You got one of the greatest games of all time, but if it ran awfully, it wouldn't even matter. This is a bit of an extreme example, but take Slay the Spire. It's the best roguelike deck builder of all time, which I guess you can argue there are contenders, but it's really good. It's a genre-defining game. Now imagine if that game ran at 10 FPS. It doesn't matter how good it is, no one would play it because it would be unplayable. Hi, I had the hindsight to put this in, but if you have any sensitivity to flashing images or anything like that, don't look at the screen for maybe the next 10-20 seconds, because this gameplay is actually just really bad. And guess what? You don't even have to imagine that. I forced my Slay the Spire to run at 10 FPS, and yeah, it's as awful as it sounds. This game is unplayable. Fun fact, I tried to run it at 5 FPS first, but I couldn't get past the initial loading screen, so I had to change it to 10. I will say, Wilds was nowhere near 10 FPS bad. It was still pretty bad. The game released to mixed reviews on Steam because of the performance, and eventually hit mostly negative a couple months later because it still ran like garbage. So obvious question is, has this been fixed since release? It depends on your system, but for the most part, yes. A lot of people have reported significant performance improvements over the last couple of patches. Personally, my friends who have lower end systems are also saying that they get pretty stable frames and they can run their game at a respectable 60 FPS most of the time. Personally, I upgraded my GPU in between this year and last year, so my performance obviously went up. However, my performance is noticeably better, and the metric I'm using is it no longer sounds like I'm in a wind tunnel whenever I boot up Monster Hunter Wilds. So I think that you can say definitively that the performance patches have worked. If that's the only reason why you stopped playing or haven't picked it up, then congrats. Have fun playing the game. Personally, performance is only 5% of the reason why I wouldn't have recommended the game to anyone when it first came out. You're probably thinking, that's kind of low, and you're right. But that's because this next part is 94% of the reason why I wouldn't have recommended this game to anyone on release. What we got on release was an incomplete game. I'm not even talking about the drip feed style content that we've been getting for the last couple games. If we look at what was released in Title Update 1, we can see that there are so many things that should have been there on release. There's no Gathering Hub, no Arena Quest, we didn't even have the high rank version of the final boss. There's also the fact that the performance was awful. On release, at bare minimum, your game's performance should be acceptable, which it very clearly wasn't. Look, I know how this sounds, but there's a very clear line between entitled and asking for things that should be there. Asking for things that have been at the release of the most recent games in the same exact series, or things that games should just generally have, is something that you should demand as a customer. If you're asking full price for a game, I should get a full game in exchange. It's not that complicated. The worst part is, I think most people, including myself, are willing to wait as long as the game comes out good and complete. I'm fully in the camp and delay until it's good. It's kind of sad that at this point we kind of have to settle for delay until it's finished, but at this point I'd rather wait for a complete game than pay full price for an incomplete one. To answer the question, yes. 1 year later, I'd say that this is a complete game. And to give them credit, a lot of the content released after the game was really good, but we'll get into that later. If you've been following along at home, you might have noticed that 5 plus 94 is only 99%. And the thing is that now that this 99 has been addressed, this 1% is kind of the only reason why I wouldn't recommend this game to anyone. And ironically, this 1% is actually going to be the bulk of what I talk about in this video. So what is this 1%? Monster Hunter Wilds was not a game made for players like me. To be more specific, Monster Hunter Wilds was a game made to get new players into the franchise. Right off the bat, let's clarify some things. 1, this is not inherently negative. In fact, I'd actually say that this is generally a positive thing. Personally, I love it when new players get into something I like because that means more people get to experience something I enjoy. That's kind of why I made some videos being like, hey, this game is cool, I think you should play it. If the developers actively make it easier for people to play something I like, I'm gonna support it in general. The second thing is that there are plenty of games that have made their games in a way to accommodate new players that were almost universally beloved. There are a lot of examples I could go to, but I think the most obvious example is Elden Ring. I think Elden Ring is universally loved and is heralded as probably one of the best Souls games, but it added a lot of things to try and bring in a new audience. There was open world, spirit ashes, the crystal tear flask, increased clarity in some of the quest lines, and a bunch of other stuff to appeal to new players. Notice how half the things I said isn't tied to making the game easier, they just make the game more engaging for new players. The last thing I wanted to clarify is why this is a negative thing, specifically in the context of Monster Hunter Wilds. I think that a lot of the changes they made in order to appeal to a new audience has the unintended side effect of alienating some of the existing player base. And that's actually where I'm going to start. The biggest and most obvious change to appeal to new players was the expansion of the story. The previous Monster Hunter games had a bare bones story at best. Some of the games tried to tell a story, but it was never really a huge focus, and I think I would consider the story minimal at best. These games were mostly presented as like a monster hunting sandbox where you just kind of go in and you hunt monsters. And maybe you have to do some like structured questing, but that's really about it. The advertising of Wilds very clearly presented itself as having a major focus in the story, and the producer even went as far as to say that the emphasis on the story is a large part of the game's success. Personally, I thought the story was just okay. I did like the exploration into different cultures, and honestly the buildup of the guild authorizes you to hunt this monster, culminating into I authorize myself to hunt this monster, was sick as hell. Other than that, I think it was a pretty standard, if not a little bit uninteresting at times. I think the thing is, people's problems on the emphasis of the story had nothing to do with the quality. It actually had a lot to do with the implementation. In the previous games, you might have gone like a small tutorial, but for the most part, you can just go and kind of hunt to your heart's content. The more recent games might throw in some cool cutscenes and they might railroad you just a little bit, but that's about it. Wild Story railroaded you a lot, and it was a pretty obvious railroad. There are a good amount of unskippable cutscenes where people are just talking, and also there's a good amount of those walk real slow while we talk and explain some stuff sections. Honestly, I didn't really think it was that big of a deal. Was it annoying? Yeah. But I was willing to give the story a shot, so I didn't really mind. However, I know a lot of people, including my friends, were pretty frustrated by this direction. And I can't say I don't sympathize with them. The entire lowering section of the game is a pretty considerable amount of time. I'd say it's about 6 or 7 hours. Railroading players that are used to a large degree of freedom for a couple hours is a pretty good way to make them mad. So I totally get people's complaints about the emphasis on the story. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I can understand their frustration. So the burning question is, has this changed? Nah, not really. They made no changes, so it kind of is what it is at this point. The post-story quests for new monsters are in the same format, but there aren't that many, so if this was a problem for you, then you don't really have to worry about it anymore. Something you might have to worry about is the difficulty of the game. A lot of people felt like the game was a lot easier than the previous titles, and honestly, I'd agree. When I was playing through the story, I felt like monsters were just falling over left and right. I never really felt like I was in any danger until I fought Gormagala, which is basically the last monster of the story in high rank. I will admit, I don't have the best perspective on this issue. I've played a decent amount of Monster Hunter. I have about like 1,000 hours across all the games I've played, but I do have the ability to step back and say, I have a decent amount of experience, so I don't know how this will translate to most other people. That being said, I do remember the early reviews of the game saying that it was a bit too easy, so I'm inclined to believe that it was definitely easier than the previous titles. In the past year of content, I say the difficulty has definitely increased. The tempered and arc-tempered versions of monsters definitely hit like trucks, and they're a little bit faster, so if you make a mistake, you're most likely going to either die or miss like 90% of your HP bar. Even some of the normal fights like Omega can still easily kill you if you're new to the fight or if you're a greedy piece of garbage like me. Overall, I'd say that if the game being too easy was a concern of yours, then this has been fixed, but basically mostly in the late game. There's something to be said about needing a year to fix the difficulty issues, but that's a conversation for another time. The last two things that we've talked about are things that I consider small or medium issues. Story issues? Not really a big deal. Game too easy? Disappointing, but ultimately more of a medium issue. These issues are also mainly singular. They only really affect one aspect of the game. This next part is easily larger than the two of them combined because it affects every single aspect of the game. In order to make the game more accessible for new players, Wilds has a lot of friction removed from it. You might have heard people talking about this idea of friction, but in case you haven't, I would define friction as any obstacle that hinders you, the player, from achieving a goal. For example, let's say you want a potion. There are two ways to go about this. You can either craft it or you can buy a potion. If you want to craft it, you need to go to your map, locate where an herb is, go to that location, open up the menu, and then you can finally craft the potion. If you want to buy it, you need to get enough money by either doing a quest, selling items, and then you go to the merchant and you buy the potion. All of these steps I've described in either case are all forms of friction. You might be wondering, why is this important? Friction is important because it often gives games a sense of identity. For example, the Resident Evil franchise has tank controls. Tank controls are these pretty cumbersome method of moving your character. In order to turn left, you'd have to rotate your character left and then move forward as opposed to just hitting left on your D-pad or something. And this control scheme was put in place to make the game scarier for players since it's harder to maneuver. I know that they've been moving away from this control scheme, but it's still a pretty iconic part of the Resident Evil franchise. Wilds has moved a lot of friction for the sake of a smoother gameplay experience. Let me be clear, I'm not against removing forms of friction if they're just super annoying and really only serve to annoy the player. A good example of this is nets and pickaxes actually used to break in the older games, so you'd have to bring like a bunch of nets and a bunch of pickaxes if you wanted to like farm a bunch of nodes, or if it broke and you only had one, you'd have to go back to camp, fix it, and then go back out again. Yeah, that can stay in the past. I will say though, the thing about friction is that it's usually pretty subjective. I know that there are a lot of fans who just heard what I said and were like, that was gas, I think we should have kept that in. And I think that there are also a lot of players that heard what I said and said, yeah, that should also stay in the past. Personally, I don't like that they remove some of the small things. I don't like how you can just clutch claw anything like rocks, bones, or whatever and just get it instantly. I kind of like having to sit there for a couple seconds and just use your pickaxe to hit a rock, or stand there and like dig through a bone pile. I don't like that there's no tracking to a monster anymore. You just kind of choose a monster, hop on your bird, and it'll just auto run to whatever you're hunting. I do like the feeling of actually having to travel to your monster and understanding the map well so you know how to like navigate the terrain and stuff. There's a lot of other things that I can name, but I don't really want to sit here sounding like Unk for another like 20 minutes. And like I said earlier, a lot of these small things are super subjective. A lot of people might agree with me, and a lot of people might say you're crazy and that these changes are good. So instead of talking about small examples that they've removed, let's talk about a big one. Focus mode has removed a significant part of friction when it comes to combat. To clarify, I actually really like focus mode. I think it's a cool concept and it makes sense when you consider things like the wound system. I just think that in its current form, it's way too strong. Currently, focus mode allows you to aim a lot of moves with a higher degree of freedom than in the previous games. And that honestly is underselling it quite a bit. You can do things like 180 TCS, and if you don't know what that is, that's the Great Sword's super big hit, and that is crazy. When you can aim moves with that degree of freedom and precision, things like positioning suddenly become a lot less important. This doesn't mean that position doesn't matter anymore. I think it's still pretty important, but now it's just less of a factor when you're dodging or setting up in front of a monster. And the degree of freedom you have has removed things like needing to know how to precisely do the TCS wake up. You can just aim it anywhere and then at the last second just pull a 180 and hit the monster. I know how this sounds, so let me clarify. I don't think it's a bad thing to lower the skill floor. In fact, I think previous games have good examples of lowering the skill floor. In World, you have the ability to slightly aim your weapons like in Greatsword and Hammer. In Rise, your Palico and Dog are pretty strong. Like they can do stuff like knockdown and they can like revive you, which they also can do in this game. But I think that the strength that they gave them in Rise were good examples of increasing player strength and making the game a bit easier. So like I said before, I'm not opposed to focus mode. I think it's good. I just think it's a bit too strong, and the current implementation lowers the skill floor a little too much for me. There are a lot of ways I think that this game removed friction, but I don't want to go over any other examples because I don't want this video to just be me bashing on Wilds. I just wanted to explain why removing friction can be a bad thing, and then give examples of Wilds removing friction just to explain why I think this is bad. Now unfortunately I know that this video has mostly been negative, but that's kind of by design. The entire premise of the video is that the game was not worth playing on release, and I could just end the video right here and just say, yeah, game bad, don't play. But I don't think that would do the game justice. So let's talk about what the game did well on release. Let's talk about the monsters, cause that's half the name of the game. Almost all of the base roster are bangers. You have Arkveld, Raydao, Zoshia, Arjakan, Jindahan. I could just basically list the entire new cast and I would just keep saying banger, 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 banger. Because they're all just really good. I think the designs are really good, they're fun to fight. Not all of the monsters that are in the base roster are amazing. Like, you have your standards like Rathian and Rathalos, but I think for the most part, the entire base roster is really good. The monsters that were released in the title updates after the release, mostly bangers. Not all of them are hits. I'm personally kind of whatever on Mizu, Sune, but other than that, bangers. Like Iacris, Gogmazios, Sergios, bangers. The Cloud Monster Omega, super cool fight. Even more so if you're like me and you've played Final Fantasy XIV, and doubly so if you've actually done the Omega fight. I think they've done a really good job porting Omega into Monster Hunter. It has a lot of moves from the 14 version, which is honestly really cool to see. And I also really appreciate that the moveset was translated well into Monster Hunter. It's also really cool that they made a normal and savage version of the fight, just like in 14 again. Overall, the monsters in this game are really well done, and I have nothing but praise for basically the entire cast. It's also really nice that the armor and weapons that come from these monsters are very well designed. There actually isn't really much to say. I mean, in the previous games, sometimes the armor and weapons were kind of whack, like not to throw shade, but in Worlds, I did not really like a lot of the armor. In Wilds, I think for the most part, they did a really good job of making each armor set and weapon look pretty cool, unique, or interesting. The post-launch armors and weapons just continue this trend. I'm personally a big fan of the Zoshia weapons and the Omega armor, but honestly all of it is good. There isn't really much to say here, like I said, so let's just move on with what you do with the armor and weapons. Fight monsters. The combat in this game is really good. I think the addition of offset moves and power clashes are great. I think that giving the player more options in combat is always a good thing, so I'm really a fan of these two things. I like that there's a risk associated with these, and risk allows for more skill expression on the player side, which is always really cool. Now, weapons can be a little bit of a touchy subject. I know a lot of weapons got changed from the previous games, and not everyone's a fan of these changes. Personally, I think the weapons overall have had great changes associated with them, but I might just be biased because my weapons have gone cool changes. For example, I really like the new Switch Axe full release skill, and I really like that I now have a guard point that's like a counter move. Full release is really cool, and having the most versatile weapon in the game, Switch Axe, get another versatile move just makes it even more versatile. Like, it's just awesome. I've also been learning Gunlance, and from what I remember from World, all the stuff that it got in this game is really cool. Now, there's so many changes that I'm not even going to go over them with all the other weapons, but I think in general the combat mechanics and change to the weapons have been really good, and have made the combat more fun and rewarding. I know that in some of the title updates some of the weapons have gotten buffs, but I don't know enough about all of them to determine whether or not it's overall been good or not. All I know is that my weapons got changed and they've got buffs, so my perspective is this is good. But if you felt like your weapon was weak, maybe you should check it out, maybe read the patch notes, or just see what other people have to say that actually play these weapons, and that way you might actually have something to look forward to. There's so many other points that I can highlight being good, like the music, area design, investigation system, you name it. I just wanted to highlight the monsters getting in combat because I think that you're going to be interacting with them the majority of the time, so I thought that I should focus on that. As always, I want people to experience things for themselves, so I'm not going to spoil anymore. If this has convinced you to play, then great. I hope you experience all the other things that are good that I didn't elaborate on. So we're finally here at the very end. So the question remains, is Monster Hunter Wilds worth playing 1 year after its release? That's up to you. No, I know, this is a cop-out answer. But I made this video with the intent of giving you enough information so you could decide for yourself. If you're okay with the performance being average, and you don't care about the changes they made to accommodate new players, then yeah, you'll probably say it's worth playing. If performance is still a deal breaker, or you really don't like the changes, or if the weapon you like sucks a lot, then you'll probably say no. I'm not going to tell you what to think, I want you to make the decision for yourself. That being said, personally, I've been playing mods casually for the last couple weeks and I have been enjoying myself. I originally stopped playing 2 weeks after the game's release because I finished my endgame sets, but also because I didn't really like the game that much. I was curious to see what changes they made a year after release, since I do really like this franchise, and I personally think now Wilds has become a pretty solid game. Going forward, I hope they learn from some of the mistakes that they've made, and I'm curious to see how the DLC turns out. They've released bangers for World and Rise for Iceborne and the Sunbreak DLC, so hopefully Wilds is the same, but you never know. This has been Monster Hunter 1 year later. Is it finally worth playing? Thanks for watching. Hi, post video me here. I'm actually kind of unsatisfied with how the video turned out, but I did want to release it on the anniversary of Wilds, so I'm not gonna say it's like a rush job, but I definitely did kind of cut some stuff to make it work. This video actually took me like a really long time to make because this is actually a redo of a video I tried to do like a year ago when Wilds initially released, but I just hated the way the video turned out because I was like so negative and I was kind of an asshole. So I just scrapped it. I didn't like it, and I'm glad I got to revisit it like a year later. Like, I think it's good. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm trying to do like a video per month. I'm not really sure how that's working out, but thanks for watching.